So we actually have four great distinguished panelists. Dr. Graham Pegg from the Australia Government Department of Health, and Professor Chen, we all know him, from the College of Medicine and Yangtze University, and also Anne, who's a consumer advocate with honorary position at the Taliesin Kids Institute. Also adjunct appointment at the University of Western Australia School of Population and Global Health. We also have Dr. Yong Chen from the Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Informatics at the University of Pennsylvania. So each of them represent one different category of the stakeholder in this evidence generation. Grant is from the regulatory aspects, and Chen is a clinician, and Anne represents a consumer, and we also have Yong more as a researcher. So without further delay, we will just start our panel, and Nicole is going to actually ask a couple questions. Go ahead. You need this.
Okay, that was a whirlwind journey through a very interesting process that, I've been involved in OHDSI studies for quite some time, but never have I really been involved from the question to the answer. And it's been an amazing journey, and the help we've got from the whole community has just been fabulous, to the point where one night I fell asleep and the next morning I had millions of results ready for me to look at and to present that morning as well. So, while you sleep, here's what I prepared earlier. So it's been a fabulous opportunity, and Jack, thank you so much for that presentation. That was amazing. So we're going to turn now to a roundtable discussion. As Wah mentioned, we have some different stakeholders who might consume the evidence that we generate. And if you haven't picked up already, the theme of this meeting really is about consuming. It's about generating evidence, and it's about consuming. But one of the really important aspects, I think, is who's setting the menu. Hence my menu. So what are the questions that each of our stakeholders need to answer? How can we deliver to them those results so that they consume it? And they're consuming the things they want to eat, they want to do something with. So what we're really trying to do here is get some perspectives from our different stakeholders about the evidence that we've generated for them. Do they trust it? What do they need? And how can we be better at actually engaging with these different stakeholders to give them what they need? And how can we prioritise our research questions so that it addresses their needs? So we've got data, we can do a million different things, but should we? What should we focus our work on? What should we prioritise so that it actually makes an impact on patient care? And if you remember back to the mission of OHDSI, that is our journey. So perhaps I can ask each of our stakeholders one by one, first of all, their reflections on the Save Our Sisyphus Challenge and the results that we produced in terms of, the trust that they have in the decisions that they might want to make. So, Grant, perhaps I can start with you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jack. Great presentation. And certainly from a study perspective, I think in a regulatory sense, it is tremendously valuable to the broader body of evidence. Regulators, like most other organisations, take a weight of evidence approach. And to me, it's what you've presented is tremendously reassuring from a regulatory perspective, which is that this may not be a thing. And if it is a thing, it's probably very rare, which is obviously great for patients, and that's very helpful. What's exciting to me about this work is the methodology and how it could be potentially utilised in the regulatory space. I was listening to the comments from the last presentation there. Yes, we as regulators have lots of questions that are left unanswered and very limited ability to be able to answer those questions. And that's often because of the time it takes. And so the rapidity of this study is something that is really appealing. Also the ability to access the broad data sets that obviously we don't ordinarily have access to. And it also strikes me that as an example of how the academic community is connecting together across the world to sort of answer some of these questions. Regulators could do the same thing in not only helping to formulate the questions for the academic community to answer, but also be able to take those results and more powerfully be able to influence industry. Thanks.
No, sorry, Chen, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm here to be representative of clinical side, and thanks, Jack, again for the perfect presentation. So I actually, as a clinician, when we saw the papers about addressing the potential adverse events of the fluoroquinolone for the aortic dissection or aortic aneurysm, then we review the paper thoroughly, and we need to send our minds to take this results or not, or take this evidence true or not. So, and then we need to decide whether we need to change our medical practice in the daily routine clinical practice. And when I see that after the publication of Korean FDA about the warning for the aortic dissection events after the initiation of the fluoroquinolone, but the Korean doctors did not change their practice. The rate of the prescription of fluoroquinolone does not change. So I think that many clinicians does not believe in this evidence. But even though it is really, truly interesting findings. But FDAs over the world, such as American FDA or EMA or Australian FDA and Korean FDA, produce the warning signs about that. And then what happens in clinician? Some patients, when we prescribe the fluoroquinolone for them, then they argued against the use of fluoroquinolone because FDA warns about the potential adverse events, which is a doctor does not actually guarantee, or we do not think that it is truly validated. So that's the one thing what happens in the world. And actually, what is really truly interesting for me is that there is such a substantial heterogeneity in the preference on the antibiotics. So you can see that there is really equipoise between trimethoprim versus fluoroquinolone in US databases, which is really, really surprising for me because I'm from the Asia and I'm trained in the Korea. So personally, I prefer cephalosporin over trimethoprim, really. And, so this is really, that means that we cannot trust the evidence from a single database. Sometimes because the preference pattern is so different, and that we cannot guarantee the possibility of the residual systematic bias. So we may need some evidence from the diverse databases representing the real world practice. So it's really a fantastic result. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack, for a presentation. Unfortunately, most of it I couldn't understand, but you already knew that. So, I think it's really interesting when you talk about the ultimate end users of the medicines, which is the patient and the clinician. And I can't talk for the clinician, but I think listening over the years, it's very difficult for someone to have a trust in real-world evidence if they can't understand what it is that's being talked about. And I had the privilege of seeing Jack's presentation and thought, I don't know what he's talking about. And so I contacted Nicole, and sorry about this, Nicole, but she sent me a plain language summary, and I thought, I still don't know what she's talking about. So she had to give me yet another plain language summary, and I thought, I've got to be a bit kinder here. So I got Google out and Googled a lot of it. And, look, I've been working in the research space for 20 years as a consumer advocate, and I found it really difficult to understand. What I did ask Nicole was, were there TGA warnings on this? And she said yes. And then I asked her and this is a question for you, I asked her what will happen now it's not as bad as what you may have originally thought. And she said, well, you've left the warnings there. So where does that put me as the patient? If I was savvy enough to go to the FDA website or the TGA website, and probably most don't, but if I was savvy enough, I might not understand it anyway. So there's a real issue around plain language and about you getting your fantastic work out, because, you know, I've been working in the medicine space too for a long time. So I have great trust in the work that you do, but perhaps it's a bit more than blind trust that's needed. You're doing all this amazing work. You've got to find a better way of bringing the public, consumers, patients along with you so they really do know what you're doing is worth it. I've got some other things, but I'll leave it for now.
So for me as a researcher, I very much agree with Nicole's point about the trust is related to where we are going to use, how we are going to use the evidence, right? So if I'm going to put my personal medical decision based on the outcome, I would put my usual habit of being OCD, just being compulsive. I would definitely like to see more studies and sensitivity analysis to evaluate the evidence. Just like FDA's habit, they want to see so-called the totality of the evidence. So definitely I would hope to see more studies looking into the source of heterogeneity. As you presented, results from different database are still somewhat heterogeneous, right? So we may want to look into the sources of heterogeneity with pre-specified protocols, not a post hoc analysis. For example, I would really love to involve a clinician, although this is a difficult process, engaging the clinicians from the beginning, but I would hope to engage a clinician at the beginning to pre-specify what are the potential effect modifiers for those causal effects, and then follow the pre-specified protocol and conduct more subgroup analysis. Then we can evaluate the totality of the evidence. So that's also another thing I would hope to see is kind of varying this criteria for definition, for the the time window and the outcome definition. We want to see how sensitive the results are with respect to those changes. So those are the things, both from a researcher or if hypothetically, if I'm a patient that relying on the decision, I would really love to see those. But on the other hand, I feel we are, as a community, we are doing the best we can for now, and there are still, but we are still more work to be done, but we are really, really close to creating the best evidence and based on the best available data. So.
Okay, that was some wonderful reflections, so thank you. So I guess we've got some questions up here, and all three of them relate to that process. So, how can OHDSI help the decision maker by generating evidence for the questions that matter? So setting the menu. What else can OHDSI do to build trust in what we're consuming? And then how can OHDSI improve the understanding about real world evidence? So perhaps, Anne, you might want to reflect then, since we have the SOS challenge was a question that was in the literature at the time. And as researchers, we thought that's a great question. We need to answer that question. We've answered the question and produced the results. So now how do we get those results into the hands of the people that need it? So, Anne, I'm not sure, do you want to reflect some more about that?
Yeah, it's quite difficult because I think when I first looked at the presentation, I thought, well, I hope if I get this, I never get offered this drug because I don't want it. And I'm writing it down in my notes so that I can remember what it's called. But then as I, went through and discovered that there was no evidence for it to, cause any more issues than, others. So, I was quite confident about that. But I wonder if that's the question. What matters to you as researchers may not matter to the community. And I think there's some real conversations to be had. And I know this is not answering your question, but I think you made mention before about in Australia, there's all these databases across and we've got a federated system. We're not good at sharing them. But I also think there's a lot of issues around the secondary use of data that we do not have conversations as far as the community goes. Are people happy with that? Do they know about it? Once I believe people think you collect the data and you should use it. And I've heard that for many, many years. But I think you as researchers and organisations like this and clinicians even, and I appreciate how busy you are, you're not good at bringing people along for those conversations. And I think when there's the risk of people's data being breached and hacked and all of those things, people get a little bit nervous about it. So it's up to you to get out there and convince them that it's really important, and there's lots of questions that can be answered. I was blown away by the amount of people, data that you were able to access through this. I just sort of thought I couldn't even get my head around it when you're looking at clinical trials with 200 in or something like that, and that's great. So, you know, I think it's really important work that you do, but your public relations is not good. And, you know, I want to ask you all a question. Put your hand up if you're a researcher. Yeah, okay. Put your hand up leave your hand up, keep your hand up. Leave your hand up if you're involving patients or community or consumers in your research. Yeah, look, so down they go. There's not many left. And, you know, that's the thing. They're the people that are going to support you and advocate for you. You've got to bring them along.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So on that note, perhaps, Greg, we can go to you and say, so as the regulator, as the body that actually allows these medicines to be used in the public, how do we as researchers communicate with you and work with you to answer questions that are important to you, which will then obviously have the downstream effects to the patients? But starting at your end, how do we help to set the research agenda with the regulators?
Thanks, Nicole. I think absolutely it's important to have not just the regulator, by the way, but all various stakeholders in the tent asking the question or helping to formulate the questions that you go forth with. I think that that step's crucial to building confidence. But working together on, it's like anything, I think it's building up that confidence in starting smaller and then working together to do that. But also leveraging the sort of networks that we have within the various groups themselves. So if the academic community is connected like this, the regulatory community needs to be connected as well, because the entities we regulate are largely pharmaceutical companies. They're global, and to actually affect good regulatory change, if you have a harmonised approach, that can be a really great way of doing it. To me, the best utility of this type of work would be where there is a local signal, perhaps in a cluster of adverse event reports or something like that, either in Australia or potentially elsewhere, overseas, where there might be a bit of biological plausibility or potentially not. It's of high risk minimisation value because it's serious, just like this one, which, dare I say, is probably why, even though the evidence was sort of not fantastic to begin with, regulators moved to include it because UTIs are a common outpatient condition. Aortic aneurysms are very, very serious and can be fatal. And so the risk minimisation value of including that in the product information is high. Nonetheless, in those situations where there's that question, but a paucity of literature, as there often is, and I could name 100 of off the top of my head that just sort of we identify, but then sort of you reach a point where you can't sort of elucidate that any further. And so it's building up that partnership. And, Sally and I were just talking about how do we do that? Do we embed research within the regulator and actually have people working directly with us so they understand the work we do too? Because I think we all need to speak the same language, and that's often the problem, or to understand the constraints that we have in what we need to do, or is it about building up that better relationship with the research centres and keeping that door open? And I think some of the things we traditionally use as barriers for that, I think the COVID-19 experience has helped to take down a lot of that. And I think to me, it seems like there's a gap in the hedge at the moment for us to really jump through and exploit that.
Agreed. So, Chen, my question to you. So you said in your reflection that clinicians have preferences, and they have preferences for what they like to prescribe. Given, and you sort of intimated that given the evidence, they might not change their practice. But what can we do as researchers to help give clinicians the evidence they need to make better choices in healthcare rather than perhaps just preference?
So again, a clinician, we actually review the papers and then we decide whether to, believe it or not. And so the producing reliable evidence with bigger, efforts and then more databases and more reliable methodological efforts will be really renowned, acknowledged by clinicians, I believe. So if we can produce the many results from the diverse databases with sufficient analysis will be acknowledged. That's what we need. And sometimes, because healthcare system across the world is really different. And even in one country, the healthcare system and accessibility is truly varied across ethnic groups or financial groups and economics groups. So even in America, there are so many different databases representing different population. And in some databases, there are more Blacks, and in some databases, there are more, aged male. And those are really heterogeneous. And so that's why we need results from the diverse databases representing different populations. And that's why that's what we need as a clinician. And even though we do have usual HN database are similar than the American databases or others, but we can leverage the results because we conducted the identical analysis across the different databases. So we can even though the results from the Asian databases did not pass the diagnostics or did not have the enough sample size, but still the results from the Asian database, by comparing the results from the Asian databases and the others, and we decide whether to believe it or not, and how much we can believe in the results. That's what we need. And I'd like to address more things, since in Korea, we conducted national surveys against the citizens. So, and we asked that, do you want the researchers use your data to produce the evidence? Then majority of Korean citizens actually want researchers to use their data to produce more evidence. That's what actually many regulatory body in Korean or in Korean governments, many people thought that many citizens didn't like their data to be used by the researchers, but it wasn't true. Actually, more citizens want to be used because when they are sick, then they need some data. Actually, they can be really desperate. And Korean FDA, which is an MDFS, actually supporting the AMAP Common Data Model Network to be engaged in the pharmacoepidemiology, and they want to ask some questions, and then they want to validate their own questions by their own. And so in COVID-19 season, they found that some of the anti-malaria medication can be dangerous, and then they produce some warnings against it, against use it. And since Korea have some kind of the nationwide drug drug system, so they actually banned to use the anti-malaria drugs for COVID-19. So that's what we are doing in Korea.
Thanks, Chen. Okay, perhaps last comment from Yong. So we've talked about how we as researchers provide evidence to different stakeholders. In the work that you've done, do you have any reflections on how we might approach distilling that really complex statistical results and statistical methods? How do we go about actually communicating that to different stakeholders? So if you could give us some tips, because obviously I need them.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a project that we are working on right now, which can serve as a great example, is a mediation analysis we are working on to study the impact of vaccination, COVID vaccination on long COVID outcome, so among pediatric population. So this is a critical question of public health importance, and only till now we have a data set which is about 10 million children 10 million patients from U.S. population. So that's highly significant. It's about 10% of the U.S. pediatric population. So we basically want to understand what is the overall impact, what is the benefit of COVID infection on protecting the long COVID outcome. If you search WHO website, it says there is a good protection through the protection of COVID infection. That's obvious. But the next question is, if the children will get infected anyway, which is the case so for most of the children, what is the direct effect of COVID vaccine on long COVID outcome? So this is for people who work on causal inference, this is a fairly simplified version of simplest possible version of the mediation analysis, but conveying this message to clinician and other stakeholder is highly non-trivial. So we have to really, as I said in the beginning, to engage the clinicians and patients at the beginning. So in our study, we actually engaged some long COVID, some patients who actually unfortunately suffer this long COVID outcomes, and including the women who was documented as the first person in the United States who had this long COVID. And also we have children's, teenagers and their parents, and then we can come together to formulate these clinical questions and understand the clinical results. We don't want to send the misleading information that can cause unexpected outcomes. So yeah, that's our experience.